After a decade of agonizing fertility treatments and staring at an empty nursery, I thought the absolute worst day of my life was realizing I might never give my husband a child. I was wrong. The true worst day was standing in the grand ballroom of the Saint Regis, watching my own younger sister rub her pregnant belly, take the microphone and announce to 400 guests that the twin boys she was carrying belonged to my husband. What they did not know was that while they were busy plotting to steal my life and humiliate me, I had already bought their entire world. If you have ever been stabbed in the back by the people whose bills you pay, hit that like button and subscribe, because you will want to hear exactly how I burned their perfect illusion to the ground. The crystal chandeliers of the St. Regis Atlanta cast a warm golden glow over the imported white orchids, but the room felt ice cold to me. I stood near the back of the ballroom, wearing a custom emerald silk gown, holding a crystal flute of champagne. Jasmine, my 28-year-old sister, stood center stage. She looked radiant in a blush maternity dress, her baby bump proudly on display. Next to the stage sat her husband Connor, a health tech billionaire who had personally funded this lavish six-figure baby shower down to the imported swans and gold leaf invitations. My biological mother, Brenda, was sitting at the front table, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the perfect role of the overwhelmed and joyful grandmother. Jasmine tapped the microphone. The lively chatter of Atlanta's elite faded into polite silence. She looked out over the crowd, her gaze scanning the room until she locked eyes directly with me. "I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate my twin boys," Jasmine said, her voice echoing clearly through the grand ballroom. "But before we cut the cake, there is a truth that needs to be spoken today. Connor, I am sorry, but you are not the father. You cannot be the father. You are completely sterile. The father of these boys is the man who truly knows how to treat a real woman. The father is Terrence." A collective gasp ripped through the room. 400 guests, including the most prominent members of our church congregation and the local business elite, turned their heads in absolute shock. I felt the champagne glass turn slick in my grip. Connor sat frozen in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had paid for the catering, the string quartet, and the very dress my sister was wearing to announce her ultimate betrayal. From the side of the room, my husband of 10 years stepped forward. Terrence, wearing a tailored navy suit paid for by my silent investments, climbed the steps to the stage. He did not look ashamed. He looked entirely triumphant. He wrapped his arm around my sister's waist, pulling her tightly against him, and kissed her neck right in front of the entire congregation. Terrence took the microphone from Jasmine's hand. He stared right at me, his expression twisting into a cruel, arrogant sneer. "I am a man of an elite lineage," Terrence announced, his voice booming through the speakers for everyone to hear. "My family built our legacy in this city for 3 generations. I have a duty as a black man to leave an heir to carry on our name. I wasted 10 years of my youth waiting on a barren wife who could not fulfill her basic biological purpose. Aaliyah could not give me a legacy." Jasmine stepped up to the plate. "She is giving me 2 sons. That is what a real woman does." He puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk tie as the crowd murmured in disbelief. "A man of my status cannot be tied down by a woman who offers nothing but dead ends," he continued, twisting the knife deeper. "Aaliyah spent her days playing around with her little renovation projects, ignoring her duties as a wife. I needed a woman who understood the assignment. Jasmine understands exactly what a man like me requires to build an empire." The silence in the ballroom was completely deafening. I could feel the pitying stares burning into my skin. For 10 long years, I had injected my stomach with hormones. I had endured countless rounds of failed treatments, miscarriages, and crushing despair. All while Terrence refused to step foot in a single clinic, claiming his bloodline was flawless and the problem lay entirely with my body. He used my silent suffering as his ultimate justification to sleep with my own sister. My mother, Brenda, did not gasp. She did not rush to my side to comfort her eldest daughter. Instead, she looked up at the stage and gave Jasmine a reassuring nod. That was the moment the final piece of the sickening puzzle clicked into place. They all knew. They had been plotting this public execution of my dignity to force me out of the picture. They wanted me to break down, to run out of the ballroom crying in humiliation so they could comfortably step into the life they thought belonged to Terrence. But I was not the fragile, broken woman they thought I was. While Terrence was busy pretending to be a self-made hedge fund vice president, flaunting a lifestyle he could not afford, I was the one quietly funneling capital into his dying portfolios to save him from federal indictment. I was the silent force buying up historic commercial properties across Buckhead. I had spent a decade building an untouchable real estate empire they knew absolutely nothing about. My wealth was vast, hidden, and entirely mine. I looked at Terrence standing there with his chest puffed out, holding the sister I had practically raised. I looked at the pitying faces of the socialites who thought my life was officially over. I did not shed a single tear. I took one last slow sip of my champagne. The cool liquid felt refreshing against my dry throat. I lowered the glass, placing it gently on a passing waiter's silver tray. Then I picked up my black crocodile handbag. I smoothed the front of my emerald gown, squared my shoulders, and began to walk slowly toward the stage. Every eye in the room tracked my movement. The whispering stopped completely. Terrence's smug smile faltered slightly as he watched me approach, expecting me to scream, throw a tantrum, or beg for my marriage. He had absolutely no idea I was about to drop the guillotine on his entire existence. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic click of my Christian Louboutin heels striking the polished marble floor. The sea of prominent guests parted for me instinctively. Socialites in designer dresses and church elders in tailored suits avoided my gaze, pulling their phones out to record what they expected to be a spectacular mental breakdown. Terrence stood on the stage with his arms still wrapped tightly around Jasmine, his triumphant smirk faltering just a fraction as he realized I was not crying. I was not running away. I was walking directly toward him with a terrifyingly calm smile on my face. I was 5 feet away from the stage steps when a figure deliberately stepped into my path, blocking me from reaching my husband and my sister. It was Vivian, my mother-in-law. She stood there in her immaculate cream-colored knit suit, her signature pearls gleaming under the chandeliers. Her face was set in a mask of haughty disdain. Vivian had never liked me, and she was not about to miss an opportunity to put me in my place in front of 400 of Atlanta's most influential people. "That is quite enough, Aaliyah," Vivian commanded, her voice carrying an icy authority that made the guests nearby hold their breath. "You are making a scene, and this family has endured enough of your shortcomings. Do not ruin this joyous occasion for my son." I looked at the woman who had sat at my dining table every Thanksgiving for the past decade, the woman whose lavish church donation pledges I had silently funded. I tilted my head, waiting for her to finish. Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so only the front rows could hear her venom. "You were never Buckhead material, Aaliyah. I told Terrence that from the very beginning. You lack the grace, the warmth, and clearly the basic physical capability of a proper wife. Jasmine is radiant. She is fertile. She is giving this family the heirs we deserve. She is the rightful daughter-in-law of this house now, so I suggest you turn around, walk out those doors, and accept your defeat with whatever little dignity you have left." Before I could even formulate a response to Vivian's profound cruelty, another woman rushed toward us from the front table. It was Brenda, my own biological mother. Any normal mother would have thrown her arms around her eldest daughter after witnessing such a humiliating public betrayal. But Brenda was not a normal mother, and Jasmine had always been her golden child. Brenda grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging into my skin. "Aaliyah, please," she hissed, her eyes darting nervously around the room, desperate to protect Jasmine's moment in the spotlight. "Just let your sister have this. Stop looking at her like that." I slowly looked down at my mother's hand on my arm, then back up to her face. "Let her have my husband, Mother," I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Oh, do not play the victim now," Brenda scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "You have always been so cold, so distant. You have been obsessed with your little renovation projects since your Spelman college days. You care more about dusty old floorboards and commercial zoning permits than you ever did about building a home. Jasmine actually knows how to keep a man happy. She gives Terrence the warmth and affection you always withheld. Consider this your penance. Give your husband to your sister Aaliyah. Consider it paying me back for everything I sacrificed to raise you. The sheer audacity of her words washed over me. This was the woman whose luxury condo I had paid off in cash when I was only 26 years old. This was the woman who had spent my entire life pushing me aside to make room for Jasmine's endless demands. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the woman who hated me, united in their defense of the sister who had just shattered my marriage. Jasmine watched from the stage, her hands resting protectively on her pregnant belly, a look of smug satisfaction washing over her features. She felt invincible. She had the baby, she had the husband, and she had the mothers acting as her personal bodyguards. She thought she had won. They all expected me to scream. They expected me to slap someone, to throw my champagne glass to validate their narrative of the bitter, emotionally unstable, barren wife. Instead, I gently pulled my arm out of my mother's grip. I smoothed down the silk of my emerald gown. The entire ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses. I unclasped the gold hardware of my black Birkin bag. The sharp click echoed in the silence. I reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder. I walked past my mother and my mother-in-law, neither of them daring to physically stop me again. I stopped at the lavish gift table positioned right at the edge of the stage. The table was piled high with designer baby clothes, silver rattles, and envelopes stuffed with cash. I swept a stack of pastel blue gift bags onto the floor with a swift, careless motion, clearing a space right in the center. I slammed the manila folder onto the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. I looked up at Terrence. He was no longer smiling. "Sign the divorce papers, Terrence," I said, my voice projecting clearly and evenly across the room, cutting through the heavy tension without a single tremor of sorrow. "The ink is already dry on my end, and I highly suggest you pack your golf clubs and your custom Italian suits tonight." Terrence stared at the folder, then let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. He let go of Jasmine and stepped to the edge of the stage, looking down at me with absolute contempt. "Pack my bags," Terrence mocked, his voice booming through the microphone still clipped to his lapel. "Have you lost your mind, Aaliyah? That is my estate. My name is on the deed to that 8,000-square-foot mansion. I pay the mortgage. If anyone is packing their bags tonight, it is going to be you. You can take your little folders and walk out of my house before I have you escorted off the property by security." He crossed his arms, basking in the murmurs of agreement from his mother and my sister, entirely oblivious to the trap that had just snapped shut around his ankles. Terrence's laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom, loud and grating. He adjusted his stance, leaning into the microphone so his voice would carry over the whispers of the 400 guests. "My estate, Aaliyah," he repeated, stretching out the words as if speaking to someone slow-witted. "You seem to have forgotten how the real world works while playing with your little interior design mood boards. I am a vice president. I sign the checks that keep the lights on in that 8,000-square-foot house. I pay the mortgage. My name is on the deed. You do not get to walk in here, hand me a piece of paper, and act like you own the place." Jasmine giggled from the stage, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, while Vivian gave a loud, theatrical sigh of agreement. The church elders in the front row nodded sympathetically at Terrence, buying into his performance of the long-suffering, successful provider dealing with a hysterical wife. I let him finish. I let the silence stretch out for a few long seconds, allowing his arrogance to fully marinate in the room. Then I reached into the manila folder that was still resting on the gift table. I did not pull out a mood board. I pulled out a stack of bank statements printed on heavy, watermarked paper. "You are right about one thing, Terrence," I said, my voice projecting clearly without the need for a microphone. "Your name was on the deed, but you have not paid the mortgage on that house in 11 months. The smug smile vanished from Terrence's face. He dropped his arm from Jasmine's waist and took a step toward the edge of the stage, his eyes darting to the papers in my hand. I held up the first document for the front row to see. "For a man so obsessed with legacy and elite lineage, you are remarkably bad at managing money." I continued pacing slowly in front of the stage. Your hedge fund has not turned a profit in 3 years. You have been bleeding clients, falsifying quarterly projections to keep your partners from panicking and hemorrhaging capital on terrible investments. You were so desperate to maintain the illusion of the Buckhead billionaire that you took out a secret second mortgage on our home just to cover your margin calls. Lies, Terrence barked into the microphone, though his voice cracked slightly. She is making this up because she is bitter. Security, get her out of here. Nobody moved. The private security guards standing near the ballroom doors had been hired by Connor, and Connor was currently sitting at his table with a terrifyingly blank expression watching Terrence squirm. I slid the next piece of paper from the stack. It is not a lie, Terrence. 2 weeks ago, your secret second mortgage officially went into default. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. You hid the notices. You intercepted the mail. You thought you could secure another fraudulent loan to patch the hole before the bank seized the property. You thought you had time. Vivian stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. Terrence, what is she talking about? Vivian demanded, her voice shrill. Tell them she is lying. Tell them your fund is fine. Terrence swallowed hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. It is a temporary cash flow issue, Mother, he muttered, the microphone catching his sudden lack of confidence. He glared down at me. The bank is working with me. I have a grace period. You know nothing about commercial finance, Aaliyah. The bank would never just kick me out. That is where you are wrong again, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational yet lethal tone. The bank was completely done working with you. They bundled your defaulted mortgage into a portfolio of distressed assets and put it up for private auction yesterday morning. They were looking for a buyer with liquid capital to take the bad debt off their hands. Jasmine let out a small, confused gasp. Terrence's eyes widened as the reality of my words began to sink in. And this is the part where you finally learn what I actually do with my days, I said, taking a step closer to the stage. I do not play with interior design mood boards. I am the sole owner and silent chief executive officer of Apex Historic Developments. I own the commercial high-rises you pass on your way to your failing office. I own the luxury retail spaces your mother shops at. And as of yesterday morning, my firm purchased your defaulted mortgage directly from the bank in cash. A collective murmur of shock rolled through the ballroom. I heard the prominent pastor in the front row whisper a prayer under his breath. Brenda. My biological mother sank slowly into her chair, her hands covering her mouth as she looked back and forth between Jasmine and me. I own the debt, Terrence, which means I own the house. I own the roof over your head, I own the marble floors you walk on, and I own the driveway where you park that leased sports car you pretend you bought. Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The microphone picked up his heavy, panicked breathing. He looked completely trapped, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity in front of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. The elite church congregation, the business associates, the socialites. They were all staring at him, not with respect, but with profound disgust. I lifted my left arm and casually glanced at the face of my Rolex. You have exactly 24 hours, I said, looking back up at his terrified face. At this exact time tomorrow, my private security firm will arrive at the estate. If you are not gone, they have strict orders to toss your custom Italian suits, your golf clubs, and whatever cheap maternity clothes your new mistress left in the guest room straight onto the street. Jasmine started to cry, grabbing Terrence's arm and shaking him. Terrence, do something, she pleaded, her voice echoing in the silent room. Tell her she cannot do this. We need that house for the babies. Terrence ignored her, his eyes locked on mine with a mixture of hatred and absolute terror. I turned on my heel, ready to walk out of the suffocating ballroom and leave them to choke on the ashes of their own making. But before I reached the center aisle, I paused and looked over my shoulder, delivering one final, devastating blow. Oh, and Terrence, I called out, my voice ringing clear and steady. I strongly suggest you figure out how to pay for an Uber to transport your things. Try using your corporate credit card right now. See what happens when a hedge fund realizes their vice president just became a massive liability. With that, I turned my back on the stage. the whispers, and the ruined lives I left in my wake. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I did not look back at my mother, who was now weeping into her napkin, nor did I look at my mother-in-law, who was clutching her chest, as if experiencing heart palpitations. I simply kept my head held high, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, stepping out of the grand doors and into the cool evening air of Buckhead. As the heavy doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the chaotic sounds of the baby shower, I took a deep breath. The first phase of my operation was complete, but the night was far from over. I needed to ensure that Terrence and Jasmine had absolutely nowhere to run. I stepped out into the valet area, where the warm Georgia night wrapped around me. The driveway was lined with luxury vehicles waiting for the event to end. I stood under the grand portico, waiting for my driver, expecting a moment of solitude to process the absolute destruction I had just unleashed. But as I pulled my phone from my purse to check the status of Terrence's accounts, a sleek black Maybach glided silently out of the darkness and pulled to a stop directly in front of me. The tinted rear window rolled down with a soft hum. I lowered my phone, expecting to see a confused valet driver. Instead, the pale, sharp features of Connor stared back at me. He was no longer in the ballroom. He had slipped out before the chaos reached its peak, and his expression was completely devoid of emotion. Connor looked at me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Get in," he said, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. "We have a family to destroy." Before my hand could even grasp the silver door handle of the Maybach, the heavy glass doors of the hotel lobby burst open behind me. Terrence came storming out into the warm Georgia night. His custom suit jacket was unbuttoned, and his face was slick with a layer of frantic sweat. He was holding his smartphone up to his face, jabbing his thumb against the glowing screen with violent, aggressive motions. I paused with my hand hovering in the air, turning my head just enough to watch the reality of his ruin finally catch up to his arrogance. Terrence was muttering under his breath, his eyes wide with rising panic. He aggressively tapped the screen, refreshing the banking application over and over again. "It is declining," he stammered, his voice stripped of the booming confidence he had paraded on stage just minutes prior. "Every single card is declining. The corporate account is locked. The joint accounts are frozen. Everything says zero balance. How did you freeze the offshore accounts, Aaliyah? You do not even know the routing numbers." I simply watched him, completely unmoved by his spiraling despair. I knew every routing number, every hidden ledger, and every shell company he had ever tried to conceal from me. Jasmine came waddling through the lobby doors right behind him. She was moving as fast as her pregnant body would allow, her blush-pink maternity gown clinging awkwardly to her frame. The smug, triumphant glow she had worn on the stage had completely vanished. Her face was flushed with terror as she grabbed Terrence by the sleeve of his expensive shirt. "What do you mean the accounts are locked?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the stone pillars of the valet portico. "Terrence, tell me she is lying. Tell me you still have the money. You promised me we were going to buy the new estate in Buckhead. You promised me you had more liquid capital than Connor." Terrence could not even look at her. He just kept staring at his phone screen, watching his entire fabricated empire disintegrate into digital dust. Jasmine began to hyperventilate, clutching her stomach as the horrifying realization washed over her. The man she had destroyed her sister's marriage for, the man she had allowed to father her children, was absolutely broke. Her billionaire safety net was sitting in the back of a luxury car, while her new provider could not even afford the valet ticket for his leased sports car. Brenda marched out of the hotel doors, next her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement. My biological mother bypassed Terrence and Jasmine entirely and marched straight up to me. Her face was contorted with the familiar indignant rage she always reserved exclusively for my failures, but this time she was using it to defend my cheating husband. "Aaliyah, you will fix this right now," Brenda demanded, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "I do not care what sort of petty financial tricks you are playing. You are embarrassing this family in front of the entire congregation. You will call the bank, you will unlock your husband's accounts, and you will apologize for this childish temper tantrum." I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. For 34 years I had craved her approval. I had paid off her mortgage, funded her lifestyle, and quietly endured her blatant favoritism just to earn a fraction of the warmth she showered on Jasmine. In that moment, standing under the glowing lights of the hotel driveway, I felt absolutely nothing for her. "I am not playing a trick, Mother," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I simply stopped paying for a lifestyle that was being used to fund my own betrayal. Terrence is broke because he is a failure. And Jasmine is panicking because she just realized she sold a billionaire for a bankrupt fraud. I am not fixing anything." The heavy wooden doors of the hotel continued to open, and the elite attendees of the baby shower began spilling out into the valet area. They clustered in small groups wearing expensive suits and designer dresses, waiting for their cars to be brought around. They tried to pretend they were not watching the spectacle, but the whispers began to ripple through the crowd like wildfire. I could hear their hushed voices carrying through the humid night air. "Did you hear what she just did?" a woman in a silver dress whispered to her husband. "That is Aaliyah Wilson. I told you she was not just some quiet housewife. She is the phantom buyer who acquired the historic Rialto building downtown last month." A prominent city developer standing near the valet podium nodded in agreement, his eyes fixed on me with newfound respect. "She is the silent chief executive of Apex Historic Developments," he murmured to his colleagues. "I heard she liquidated 2 competing commercial firms last quarter without even blinking. Terrence never stood a chance against her. He thought she was just decorating houses, but she basically owns half the commercial real estate in this zip code." The whispers continued, painting a picture of my true identity. I was no longer the barren, neglected wife of a loudmouth hedge fund manager. The elite of Atlanta were finally seeing the silent, formidable predator I had been forced to become. Brenda heard the whispers and her face paled. She looked at me as if seeing a stranger. "You cannot just leave us like this." Brenda stammered, her authoritative tone crumbling into desperate panic. "We are your family. Aaliyah." I slowly turned my back on my screaming mother, my hyperventilating sister, and the man who had wasted a decade of my life. I did not offer them another word. They had made their choices, and now they would have to survive the consequences. I reached out and pulled open the heavy door of the black Maybach. The leather interior smelled of expensive cologne and absolute power. Connor was sitting in the back seat, bathed in the soft ambient light of the luxury vehicle. His pale, sharp features were completely relaxed, but his eyes held a cold, calculating fury that matched my own. He looked at the wreckage of my family standing on the curb, then shifted his gaze back to me. "Get in, Aaliyah." Connor said, his voice incredibly smooth and devoid of any hesitation. "We have a family to destroy." I slid into the plush leather seat and closed the door, firmly shutting out the sounds of Terrence shouting my name. The driver shifted the car into gear, and the Maybach glided seamlessly into the Atlanta night, leaving them all standing in the driveway with absolutely nothing. The heavy doors of the Maybach clicked shut, sealing us inside a soundproof vault of black leather and mahogany trim. The driver smoothly accelerated away from the Saint Regis, leaving the chaotic, glowing entrance of the hotel far behind us. The silence in the back seat was absolute. Connor did not look at me immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the passing streetlights of Buckhead, his face a sculpted mask of cold indifference. I watched him carefully, expecting to see the devastated posture of a betrayed husband. I expected red eyes, a shaking voice, or perhaps the furious ranting of a man whose pride had just been publicly shredded. There was none of that. Connor was dead calm. He reached out to the polished console between us, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler, and took a slow, deliberate sip. He was not heartbroken. He was furious, but it was a calculated, icy fury. It was the anger of a billionaire who had just been deeply disrespected by people he considered intellectually inferior. Jasmine made a severe miscalculation. Connor finally spoke, his voice low and perfectly controlled. She mistook my quiet nature for weakness. She thought because I provided her with an unlimited black card and allowed her to play house in my mansion that I was oblivious to her extracurricular activities. She assumed those twin boys were her permanent insurance policy. I turned slightly in my seat, watching the streetlights cast sharp shadows across his face. "She thought you would be trapped," I said, my voice matching his quiet intensity. "She thought you would pay to avoid the scandal." Connor let out a short, humorless laugh. He swirled the liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly. "Scandal is a problem for politicians and actors, Aaliyah. For a man in my position, it is simply an inconvenience. And Jasmine is about to learn that I do not negotiate with inconveniences. Before we were married, I had my attorneys draft a prenuptial agreement so ironclad it practically required a blood sacrifice to sign. Jasmine was so blinded by the zeros in my bank account that she barely read the infidelity clause." He turned his head to look directly at me, his blue eyes sharp and unblinking. "The terms are very clear. If she steps outside the marriage, she leaves with exactly what she brought into it. Zero. There will be no alimony. There will be no spousal support. There will be no division of assets. The fact that she is carrying another man's children is the ultimate undeniable breach of contract. By tomorrow morning, my legal team will have frozen her personal accounts, canceled her credit cards, and locked her out of the estate. She will be standing on the curb with the clothes on her back." A small, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. We were two betrayed spouses, but we were not victims. We were predators calmly discussing the slaughter of our prey. "But ruining Jasmine is only half the job," Connor continued, leaning back against the plush leather seat. "I want to ruin Terrence too. I want to salt the earth so nothing ever grows for him again. And that is why you are in this car, Aaliyah. Because I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you have been doing for the last 3 years." I kept my expression entirely neutral, but my heart gave a single hard thud. I waited for him to explain. Connor took another slow sip from his tumbler. "Terrence is a loud, arrogant fool. He did not survive this long in the hedge fund game by being smart. His portfolios have been toxic waste for years. He should have been indicted by the Federal Trade Commission 36 months ago. But miraculously, every time his fund was about to trigger an audit, the numbers suddenly balanced. Toxic assets were quietly offset by clean capital. The books were scrubbed, the ledgers were smoothed out, and Terrence survived another quarter thinking he was a financial genius." Connor leaned slightly closer, his gaze piercing. "I had my cybersecurity team look into his firm's architecture last week when I first suspected the affair. They tracked the IP addresses handling the emergency capital injections. They all traced back to secure servers owned by Apex Historic Developments. You have been the financial ghostwriter fixing his botched portfolios for years, Aaliyah. You were covering his tracks, saving him from a federal indictment just to protect your family name." I looked out the window at the dark trees lining the road. I had spent countless sleepless nights moving my own clean money into his failing accounts, patching the holes in his sinking ship. I did it because I believed in loyalty. I believed in protecting my husband. It was a humiliating truth, but I had no reason to deny it anymore. "I stopped patching the holes last week," I said, turning back to Connor. "The family name means absolutely nothing to me now. He is drowning and I am the one holding the hose." "Good," Connor said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Because I need a favor." Jasmine was sloppy. She used a shell account I was monitoring to buy Terrence gifts. Expensive gifts. Custom suits, golf club memberships, and a solid gold Rolex. She embezzled my money to fund her affair. I have the bank statements, but I need the matching internal ledger from Terrence's home office to prove he knowingly received stolen assets. I know you cleared out his study before you came to the baby shower. I need that ledger, Aaliyah. I knew exactly which leather-bound ledger he was talking about. It was sitting in a secure safe at my corporate office. "And what do I get in return?" I asked, tilting my head. Connor set his crystal tumbler down on the console. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive, holding it up between us. "My team did not just track your IP addresses," he said, a dark smile finally appearing on his face. "They bypassed Terrence's firewall entirely. This drive contains the raw, unedited server logs from his hedge fund. It shows every fraudulent trade, every falsified client report, and every instance of wire fraud he committed independently of your help. If you hand this over to the Securities and Exchange Commission, he will not just go bankrupt. He will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." I looked at the small piece of silver metal gleaming in the dim light of the Maybach. It was the key to absolute, total destruction. It was the weapon that would ensure Terrence never saw the light of day as a free man again. Connor wanted the ledger to guarantee Jasmine faced criminal embezzlement charges alongside her devastating divorce. We both held the exact ammunition the other needed to finalize the execution. I looked up from the flash drive and met Connor's cold, calculating eyes. I extended my right hand across the center console. Connor reached out and grasped my hand, his grip firm and resolute. We shook hands in the quiet darkness of the luxury car, sealing a pact of mutual annihilation. "Drive me to my office, Connor," I said, my voice ringing with lethal certainty. "We have a trade to make." The morning sun over Atlanta was bright and unforgiving, casting harsh light on the desperate illusions Terrence was still trying to maintain. After a night of locked doors and frozen bank accounts, Terrence was cornered. Jasmine was hysterical, demanding proof that her billionaire lifestyle had not just evaporated into thin air. To pacify her and salvage his own fragile ego, Terrence brought her to a premier exotic auto boutique in the heart of Buckhead. He promised her a push gift, a custom Range Rover autobiography. He told her not to worry about the frozen domestic accounts because he had a secret offshore account in the Caymans. He genuinely believed I did not know about it. He forgot that a ghostwriter sees every single line of code and every hidden wire transfer. Inside the pristine glass showroom, Jasmine paced around a gleaming white SUV, her blush maternity dress replaced by oversized designer sunglasses and an expensive silk tracksuit. She was acting the part of the wealthy socialite barking demands at a highly polished salesman named Julian. Julian wore a tailored suit and a practiced smile, hovering around them with the expectant eagerness of a man anticipating a massive commission. He offered them sparkling water and nodded along to Jasmine's endless list of required custom upgrades. Terrence stood by the finance desk, exuding a completely fabricated aura of control. He pulled a sleek metal card from his wallet and dropped it onto the glass counter with a sharp clatter. "Put it all on this one," Terrence ordered, his voice dripping with forced arrogance. "Do not bother with financing. We are doing a direct wire transfer from my offshore holdings. Just run the initial deposit and draw up the title in my wife's name." Jasmine preened at the word wife, completely ignoring the fact that Terrence was still very much legally married to me. Julian nodded enthusiastically and slid the heavy metal card into the terminal. He tapped the screen, waiting for the glorious sound of an approved transaction. Instead, the machine let out a harsh, flat beep. Julian frowned. He pulled the card out, wiped it on his lapel, and inserted it again. Another flat beep echoed through the quiet showroom. The screen flashed red with a boldly printed denial code. "I apologize, sir," Julian said, his customer service smile tightening at the corners. "It seems the card is declining. The system says to contact your financial institution." Terrence snatched the card back, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Run it again," he snapped. "That account has 7 figures in it. Your machine is broken. Try this one." He threw another card onto the glass. Julian swiped it. Declined. Terrence threw a third card. Declined. The snobby salesman slowly dropped his hands to his sides, the polite smile fading entirely from his face. His posture shifted from fawning respect to thinly veiled disdain. He looked at Terrence the way one might look at a stray dog that had wandered into a 5-star restaurant. Jasmine stopped admiring the leather interior of the Range Rover and marched over to the desk, her panic from the previous night returning with full force. "Terrence, what is happening?" she hissed, grabbing his arm. "You said the offshore money was safe. You promised me this car." While Terrence was busy sweating through his designer shirt and swearing at the bewildered salesman, I was standing 30 feet away on the sidewalk. I had not followed them. I was simply conducting my normal business. I was scheduled to meet a commercial real estate broker to finalize the acquisition of the massive vacant lot situated directly next to the auto boutique. It was a prime piece of Buckhead real estate, and Apex Historic Developments had been negotiating the purchase for months. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the dealership, I watched my husband humiliating himself. I watched my sister realizing her sugar daddy was completely bankrupt. It was a pathetic display. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy business suit, adjusted my briefcase, and decided to cut my outdoor meeting short. I gestured for my broker to follow me, and I walked straight through the double doors of the luxury car dealership. The cool air conditioning rushed over me as I stepped onto the showroom floor. Terrence was in the middle of threatening to have Julian fired loudly, demanding to speak to the general manager. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment he heard the familiar rhythm of my heels. Jasmine spun around, pulling her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose. Her jaw dropped open. "Aaliyah," she gasped, stepping backward until she hit the bumper of the white Range Rover. I did not even look at them. I walked directly past Terrence's sweating, panicked frame and approached the dealership manager, who had just hurried out of his back office to handle the commotion. The manager looked at me and immediately recognized the broker standing by my side. "Miss Wilson," the manager said, his tone instantly shifting from defensive to highly respectful. "We did not expect you inside today. We thought you were just surveying the lot next door." "It is too hot outside to stand on asphalt," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm and pleasant. "Let us finish our transaction in here if you do not mind." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a certified bank draft. I handed it to my broker right in front of Terrence and Jasmine. The broker smiled broadly and handed the manager the finalized deed to the commercial lot. $9 million, the broker announced cheerfully, reviewing the paperwork. "Paid in full. Apex Historic Developments now officially owns the entire block. Congratulations, Aaliyah." Terrence stared at the certified draft in the broker's hand. His eyes bulged as the reality of the numbers hit his brain. He was standing there fighting over a declined credit card for a car, while I casually finalized a $9 million cash acquisition right next to him. The absolute disparity in our power was no longer a secret. It was a physical, suffocating presence in the room. Julian, the salesman, looked from Terrence's declined plastic cards to my multi-million-dollar bank draft and slowly took a step away from my husband. "You!" Terrence shouted, his voice cracking as his humiliation boiled over into pure, unadulterated rage. "You locked the Cayman accounts. You froze everything. You set me up." He lunged forward, taking 2 aggressive steps toward me. My broker stepped in front of me defensively, but I simply held up a hand, stopping him. I looked Terrence up and down, taking in his disheveled suit, his red face, and his absolute powerlessness. "You are going to pay for this, Aaliyah," Terrence screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You cannot just take my life and leave me with nothing. You will pay for this." I closed my briefcase with a sharp, final click. I looked him dead in the eyes, my expression entirely devoid of mercy. "I already did," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed perfectly in the silent showroom. "By the way, the feds are auditing your hedge fund at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Do not be late." The deafening roar of diesel engines and the rhythmic pounding of jackhammers provided the perfect soundtrack for my afternoon. I stood at the epicenter of a massive dirt lot in Midtown, wearing a white hard hat and a tailored navy blazer over my work boots. This was the future site of Apex Tower, a 40-story commercial high-rise that would officially cement my dominance over the Atlanta real estate market. I was reviewing a massive set of blueprints spread across the hood of my site manager's truck when a flash of bright canary yellow caught the corner of my eye. It was Brenda. My mother was marching through the active construction site, treating the Georgia red clay like it was a red carpet. She was wearing a brightly colored church suit, complete with a matching wide-brimmed hat, and carrying a pristine white designer handbag. Her expensive heels were sinking deep into the mud with every furious step she took, but she did not seem to care. She was on a mission. She had tracked me down, and her face was contorted with the exact same self-righteous indignation she had displayed the night before. I calmly rolled up the blueprints and handed them to my site manager, instructing him to take an early lunch. I crossed my arms over my chest and waited as the woman who gave birth to me finally reached my position, panting slightly from the exertion of walking through the dirt. "Aaliyah." "What on earth is wrong with you?" Brenda demanded, stopping just inches from me. Her voice was shrill, competing with the noise of the heavy machinery operating behind us. Do you have any idea what you have done? The federal authorities raided Terrence's office an hour ago. They hauled him out in handcuffs right in front of his entire staff. I know, I replied, my voice perfectly flat and unbothered. I am the one who gave them the server logs. Brenda gasped, clutching a hand to her pearl necklace as if I had just confessed to murder. You are out of your mind, she hissed, leaning closer. You are tearing this family apart out of pure spite. Pastor Davis called me this morning, Aaliyah. Half the congregation saw what happened at the hotel last night, and the other half is reading about Terrence's arrest on the local news blogs right now. You are making a spectacle of us. You are ruining our reputation in the church. I looked at her, completely fascinated by the depth of her delusion. Your reputation, I asked, tilting my head slightly. Your daughter slept with my husband for 3 years. She paraded her pregnancy on a stage in front of the city's elite. But you are upset because I stopped paying for the privilege of being humiliated. You think my refusal to be a victim is a threat to your social standing at a church you only attend to gossip. You need to stop this childish revenge right now, Brenda ordered, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. You are acting like a bitter, jealous woman. Jasmine made a mistake, but she is family. Terrence made a mistake, but he is still your husband. You need to call your high-priced lawyers, you need to go down to that federal building, and you need to fix this mess before Terrence goes to prison. Black families stick together, Aaliyah. We protect our own. We do not air our dirty laundry for the world to see. I let out a slow, steady breath. The absolute audacity of her demands washed over me, but it did not trigger the old familiar ache of rejection. It only solidified my utter detachment from this woman. You want to talk about family unity? I said, taking a deliberate step toward her, forcing her to look up into my eyes. You want to talk about protection and loyalty? You have never protected me a day in your life, Brenda. You spent my entire childhood treating me like a burden while you treated Jasmine like a princess. I sacrificed everything for you girls, Brenda yelled, her face flushing a deep, angry red beneath the brim of her yellow hat. I raised you by myself. I worked my fingers to the bone as a single mother so you could have a roof over your head. You owe me respect. You sacrificed absolutely nothing, I countered, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that sliced right through the construction noise. Do not stand in the mud of my multi-million-dollar development and lie to my face. I was the one working 2 jobs in high school. I was the one who skipped college parties to study real estate law so I could pull us out of debt. Do you remember what happened when I turned 26, Mother? Do you remember the day I handed you a cashier's check for $84,000? Brenda blinked, her eyes darting away for a fraction of a second. I paid off your house, I stated, delivering the facts with brutal precision. I paid off the mortgage you had defaulted on 3 times. I bought the car you drove here in. I funded the wardrobe you are wearing right now. I paid for the lifestyle that you used to look down on me. I was your retirement plan, and you repaid me by holding my sister's hand while she destroyed my marriage. You do not get to invoke family unity now that the bank accounts are frozen. Brenda straightened her spine desperately, trying to maintain her fragile authority. Jasmine is sweet, she insisted, her voice trembling with stubborn denial. Jasmine is carrying twins. She is terrified, Aaliyah. She would never intentionally destroy this family. She just wanted security. Terrence promised her a beautiful life, and now she has nothing because you are throwing a temper tantrum. I stared at her for a long, silent moment. The absolute blind loyalty she held for Jasmine was almost impressive. It was time to shatter it completely. I reached into the inner pocket of my navy blazer. My forensic accounting team had been working through the night, following every digital thread connected to Jasmine and Terrence. I pulled out a folded piece of thick white paper. I slowly unfolded it and held it out. What is this? Brenda asked, eyeing the paper suspiciously but making no move to take it. It is a bank statement, I said, my tone dangerously calm. When Connor locked Jasmine out of his accounts yesterday, she panicked. She knew Terrence's hedge fund was collapsing, and she needed liquid cash to maintain her fake billionaire lifestyle. She needed money to buy the custom Range Rover she was trying to purchase this morning. Brenda frowned, clearly not understanding the connection. What does that have to do with me? She asked. I thrust the paper into her hand, forcing her to take it. Jasmine has always been listed as an emergency proxy on your banking accounts, I explained, watching the color slowly drain from my mother's face as she read the highlighted numbers on the page. Yesterday afternoon, Jasmine transferred your entire $200,000 retirement fund into an unregulated offshore crypto account. She thought she could double the money and put it back before you noticed. Brenda let out a small, choked gasp. Her eyes widened in absolute terror as she stared at the zero balance printed at the bottom of the statement. But the crypto market took a massive hit early this morning. I continued delivering the final fatal blow with absolute precision. The account she used crashed to zero. It is gone, Mother. Every single penny you had to your name was gambled away by your sweet, innocent Jasmine. Brenda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her hands began to shake violently. The pristine white designer handbag slipped from her grasp, hitting the red Georgia mud with a heavy, wet thud. She stared at the piece of paper, her breathing shallow and erratic, as the horrifying reality of her favorite daughter's betrayal finally destroyed her world. The ride back to my corporate office was a study in absolute tranquility. I left my mother standing ankle-deep in the wet Georgia clay, staring at the physical proof of her own financial ruin. By the time I sat down behind my massive mahogany desk, the silence of my penthouse suite felt like a victory lap. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and turned my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The city belonged to me now. My private phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood surface of my desk. The caller identification displayed my sister's name. I let it ring 3 times before I finally tapped the screen and accepted the call. I did not say a word. I simply waited for the chaos to spill through the receiver. Jasmine was practically hyperventilating. The background noise coming through the speaker sounded like a busy public intersection with cars rushing past and loud horns blaring in the distance. She was gasping for air, her voice a jagged, frantic mixture of furious screams and terrified sobbing. "Aaliyah, you have to help me!" Jasmine wailed, the shrill sound piercing through the quiet elegance of my office. Mother kicked me out. She literally threw me out of the house. She grabbed my arm and shoved me out the front door like I was a stranger. She threw my designer bags and my clothes right onto the front lawn and told me I was dead to her. She called me a thief, Aaliyah. She screamed at me in front of the neighbors and called me a parasite. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. "You stole her entire life savings, Jasmine," I said, my voice perfectly even. "You liquidated her retirement fund and gambled it on a volatile offshore crypto market that collapsed overnight. What exactly did you expect her to do? Bake you a pie and offer you the guest room?" "I was just trying to secure my future," Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking with desperate entitlement. "Connor locked me out. I went back to our luxury penthouse after that absolute disaster at the car dealership, and my key code did not work. The biometric scanner rejected my fingerprint. Connor had his private security team waiting for me in the lobby. They stood there in their black suits and escorted me off the premises like I was a common criminal. They told me if I set foot on the estate property again, they would have the police arrest me for trespassing. He took everything, Aaliyah. He took my jewelry, my credit cards, my car. I have nothing but the clothes on my back and these babies." "And where is your billionaire savior?" I asked, letting a trace of dark amusement slip into my tone. "Where is the man you destroyed my marriage to protect?" "He is gone." Jasmine sobbed, the reality of her abandonment finally breaking her. "Terrence will not answer his phone. His assistant told me he ran out the back exit of his office building the second the federal agents walked through the front doors. Black government vehicles surrounded his building. They are auditing his entire hedge fund. They are seizing his computers, freezing his remaining domestic accounts, and boxing up all his files. He left me, Aaliyah. I am stranded on the sidewalk. I am pregnant, alone, and I have nowhere to go. You have to wire me some money. You have to send a private car for me. You are my sister, and you owe me." I sat back in my leather chair, staring out at the gleaming glass towers of Midtown. You stopped being my sister the moment you decided my husband was your ticket to a luxury lifestyle, I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any sympathy. You made your bed with a bankrupt fraud and a vengeful billionaire. Now you get to sleep in the dirt. Do not ever call this number again. I moved my finger to end the call, but Jasmine let out a vicious guttural shriek that stopped my hand. It was the sound of a cornered animal realizing it was about to be slaughtered. The desperate begging instantly vanished from her tone, replaced by a venomous, calculating malice. If you do not help me right now, I will absolutely destroy you. Jasmine snarled, her tone dripping with pure hatred. You think you are so powerful now. You think because you own a few commercial buildings, everyone is going to bow down to you. But I know your weakness, Aaliyah. I know exactly how to ruin this flawless corporate image you are trying to build for yourself. I remained perfectly silent, letting her dig her own grave. Tomorrow night is the annual African American Heritage Gala. Jasmine continued, her breath hitching as she rushed through her vindictive plan. The entire black elite of Atlanta will be there. The mayor, the city council, the biggest real estate developers, and the wealthiest investors in the state. I know you bought a premier table. I know you are planning to show your face and rub your newfound success in everyone's faces. But I am going to be there too. I am going to walk right into that grand ballroom, and I am going to tell every single person in that room exactly who you really are. And who is that Jasmine? I asked, my voice dropping to a cool whisper. You are a barren, dried-up husk of a woman, Jasmine spat, weaponizing the deepest trauma of my life without a single ounce of hesitation. I am going to tell them that you are mentally unstable. I am going to tell the entire city that you orchestrated this massive vindictive setup because you are a bitter, broken wife who could not even give her husband a child. I will tell them you lost your mind with jealousy because I was woman enough to give Terrence the family you denied him. I will stand on a table and scream it to the whole room. I will make sure everyone looks at the great Aaliyah Wilson and sees nothing but a crazy, infertile psycho. Your professional reputation will be absolute trash by the time they serve the main course. She was panting heavily now, convinced she had finally found the leverage she needed. She truly believed she could shame me into submission. She thought the old Aaliyah, the quiet, obedient wife who hid her fertility struggles behind forced smiles, was still alive. She did not realize that woman was dead and buried. Wire $100,000 to my temporary account right now, Jasmine demanded, her voice regaining its arrogant edge. Send a private car to pick me up and book me a luxury suite at the Four Seasons. If you do exactly what I say, I will stay quiet. If you do not, I will see you at the gala tomorrow and I will burn your name to the ground. I listened to the sound of traffic humming in the background of her call. I thought about the years of silent tears I had shed in empty nurseries. I thought about the pain I had endured while my own flesh and blood plotted to replace me. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I brought the phone closer to my mouth. I laughed softly into the receiver. The sound was light and completely unbothered. Wear your best maternity dress, Jasmine, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal purr. Because I am the keynote speaker tomorrow night, and I have a special presentation just for you. The African American Heritage Gala was the crown jewel of the Atlanta social season. The historic downtown venue was completely transformed for the evening, with towering floral arrangements of white orchids and dripping crystals catching the ambient light. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters in immaculate black uniforms circulated with trays of expensive champagne. The room was packed with the most powerful figures in the state. City council members, wealthy investors, elite real estate moguls, and the entire upper echelon of the local church congregation were all mingling under the vaulted ceilings. Jasmine had arrived early, determined to set the narrative before I could even show my face. She was wearing a floor-length emerald green maternity gown that clung tightly to her swelling stomach. She had positioned herself perfectly near the center of the ballroom, holding court with the most prominent members of Pastor Davis and his congregation. She was playing the role of the devastated victim with Oscar-winning precision. I could see her from the shadows of the upper mezzanine before I made my official entrance. She was dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a lace tissue, making sure everyone could see her distress. She just completely lost her mind, Jasmine whispered loudly to a cluster of wealthy church elders. Her voice was trembling with manufactured grief. Terrence and I made a mistake, but we were trying to handle things privately. Aaliyah found out about the twins and she just snapped. She used her corporate connections to freeze all of Terrence's bank accounts. She locked him out of his own firm. She is trying to leave him absolutely homeless. She wants to put me and these innocent babies out on the street, all because she is so incredibly bitter. The church gossips gasped, pressing their hands to their chests in synchronized horror. An older woman wearing an oversized diamond necklace shook her head in sheer disgust. "That is an absolute sin," the woman murmured, patting Jasmine on the arm. "To attack an expectant mother out of pure barren jealousy is unforgivable. We all know Aaliyah struggled for years, but to punish you for a blessing from above is just wicked. Terrence must be beside himself. We will make sure the entire congregation prays for you, Jasmine. Aaliyah has clearly lost her spiritual way." Jasmine nodded tragically, soaking up the sympathy and weaponizing it. She was convinced she had won. She thought she had effectively destroyed my reputation, turning the city elite against me before the first course was even served. She was so busy reveling in her stolen spotlight that she did not notice the heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom swinging open. I did not arrive in a traditional sequined dress or a shimmering ball gown. I had not come to attend a party. I had come to execute a hostile takeover. I stepped into the ballroom wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored white silk tuxedo. The cut was aggressive and flawless, the bright white fabric contrasting fiercely with the deep, rich tone of my skin. I wore absolutely no jewelry aside from a vintage emerald ring on my right hand. The look screamed pure, unapologetic power. I was not walking alone. I was flanked by 3 of the most ruthless and successful commercial developers in the Southeast. These were men who routinely leveled city blocks and built skyscrapers before breakfast. They walked slightly behind me, treating me with the kind of deference usually reserved for royalty. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. The soft hum of classical music and polite conversation simply died. It was as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the massive ballroom. Heads turned one by one. The whispers that had been circulating about my mental instability completely evaporated the second they saw me. I did not look like a broken, jealous housewife. I looked like the silent owner of the city. Jasmine noticed the sudden quiet. She turned around, her tear-stained act faltering as she saw the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. Her jaw physically dropped. She stared at my white tuxedo, and the powerful men surrounding me, her emerald maternity dress, suddenly looking cheap and irrelevant. She braced herself, expecting me to march over and cause a scene. She wanted me to scream so she could point and prove I was crazy. Instead, I completely ignored her. I glided across the polished marble floor, heading straight toward the front of the room. Pastor Davis was standing near the main stage speaking with the mayor. When he saw me approaching, he abruptly excused himself and rushed forward. Jasmine watched closely, a smug smile trying to return to her face. She fully expected the prominent pastor to turn me away or lecture me on my lack of Christian grace, based on the lies she had just spread. Instead, Pastor Davis stopped right in front of me and bowed his head with profound, unmistakable respect. He reached out and took both of my hands in his. "Aaliyah," he said, his booming voice carrying across the silent room for everyone to hear. "It is a profound honor to finally welcome you tonight. We are all so deeply humbled by your presence. You are quite literally the savior of our community." Jasmine stumbled backward, bumping into a cocktail table. The crystal glasses rattled loudly. Her entire fabricated narrative crumbled into dust right in front of the congregation. The wealthy women who had just been pitying her stared at the pastor in absolute bewilderment. They could not comprehend why the moral compass of their church was bowing to the woman they had just branded a bitter villain. "It is my pleasure, Pastor," I replied, my voice smooth and projecting perfectly. "I always protect my investments." Pastor Davis smiled warmly and patted my hands before turning toward the grand stage. He climbed the short set of velvet-lined stairs and walked directly to the mahogany podium. He tapped the microphone twice, bringing the massive ballroom to complete attention. Ladies and gentlemen, Pastor Davis began, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. Tonight we gather to celebrate our heritage and our future. As many of you know, our historic community center was facing imminent foreclosure last quarter. We were terrified of losing a safe haven for our youth. But a miracle happened. An anonymous donor stepped forward, cleared the entire multi-million-dollar debt, and funded a 10-year endowment to guarantee our doors remain open forever. The crowd erupted into spontaneous applause, but Pastor Davis held up his hands, signaling for quiet. For months, this incredible benefactor demanded total anonymity. He continued looking directly down at me. But tonight, she has finally allowed us to acknowledge her extraordinary grace. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the woman who saved our church, our keynote speaker and the silent force behind Apex Historic Developments, Miss Aaliyah Wilson. The spotlight swung across the room, illuminating my white tuxedo in a blinding beam of light. The applause was deafening. I turned slowly, letting my gaze sweep over the cheering crowd until my eyes locked directly onto Jasmine. She was shaking, her face pale and contorted with absolute terror. I smiled casually, unbuttoning the single button of my jacket as I began my slow, deliberate walk toward the stage. I was ready to deliver my special presentation. The wooden floorboards of the grand stage felt incredibly solid beneath my boots as I took the final step up from the ballroom floor. Pastor Davis smiled warmly and handed me the heavy silver microphone. He stepped back respectfully, expecting a gracious, tearful speech about giving back to the community and the importance of charity. He expected a polite corporate platitude from a wealthy benefactor. I adjusted my grip on the microphone and looked out into the blinding glare of the spotlights. As my eyes adjusted to the dramatic lighting, I focused directly on the VIP table, positioned front and center. It was the absolute best table in the house, draped in black velvet and completely covered in expensive white floral arrangements. Terrence sat there looking like a man who had just been handed his own death warrant. His custom tuxedo hung loosely on his panicked, sweating frame. Beside him, Jasmine was practically sinking into her chair, her emerald green maternity dress no longer looking like a symbol of triumph, but a neon sign of her profound guilt. And right next to them sat Vivian. My formidable mother-in-law glared up at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. Vivian wore a heavy diamond necklace and a deeply pinched expression that suggested she was smelling something rotten. For 7 long years, Vivian had made it her personal mission to remind me that I was merely a temporary guest in her elite world. She came from a long line of Atlanta socialites, and she never missed a single opportunity to point out my blue-collar roots. She leaned forward in her chair right now, practically vibrating with aristocratic rage that I, a woman she considered entirely beneath her, was standing on the stage receiving the utmost admiration of her peers. I raised the microphone to my lips. The massive ballroom was so incredibly quiet I could hear the faint hum of the audio equipment. I bypassed the standard gala pleasantries entirely. "Vivian," I said, my voice carrying perfectly through the massive overhead speakers and cutting through the tension. "You always told me I was not elite enough for your family legacy. You sat at my dining table on Thanksgiving and told me that Terrence needed a woman who understood generational wealth. You said I was just a worker bee who lacked the proper pedigree to stand beside a true visionary like your son. You called my work ethic tacky." Vivian stiffened, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, hateful slits. She looked around nervously as the wealthy congregation members at the surrounding tables began to shift in their seats, their polite smiles fading into expressions of deep confusion. "You told everyone who would listen that your son was a financial genius, carrying on the proud, flawless tradition of the Wilson family name." I continued, pacing slowly and deliberately across the front of the stage. "So tonight, since we are all gathered here to celebrate heritage and legacy, I thought it would be highly appropriate to look at exactly how your son funds that prestigious legacy." I turned my head slightly and nodded to my lead audio-visual technician stationed in the sound booth at the far back of the room. We had coordinated this moment flawlessly. The bright chandeliers in the grand ballroom instantly dimmed, plunging the audience into a dramatic shadow. A second later, the massive 30-foot digital projection screen behind me hummed to life. It did not display the logo of Apex Historic Developments. It did not show a heartwarming picture of the youth center. It displayed a highly detailed, heavily magnified financial document. The stark white background and sharp black text illuminated the entire stage. I heard a collective gasp ripple through the front rows as hundreds of people squinted to read the bold numbers projected above my head. "Let us take a very close look at the financial genius of Terrence Wilson," I announced, gesturing gracefully toward the glowing screen. As Pastor Davis mentioned earlier, this church was inches away from losing the community center to foreclosure. You were all told it was due to a simple mix-up with the mortgage company. You were told funds were just tied up. But the truth is much darker. Look at the column on the left. That is the routing number for the church charity fund, the exact fund designated to repair the youth center roof and keep the after-school programs running. Now look at the column on the right. Terrence stared up at the screen, his mouth falling open, as he realized exactly what my forensic accountants had uncovered. He gripped the edge of the velvet-covered table, his knuckles turning stark white. The document on the screen clearly highlighted a series of wire transfers. $50,000 had been systematically drained from the church charity account over a period of 3 months. But the money did not go to a roofing contractor. It did not go to the youth center. The transaction destinations were listed in bold red font for the entire city to see. Milan Luxury Imports, the Buckhead Premier Maternity Boutique, private offshore accounts. $50,000, I stated, letting the massive number hang heavily in the silent ballroom. $50,000 stolen directly from the collection plates of this very congregation, stolen from the youth center. And where exactly did it go? It went to pay for the designer maternity wardrobe currently draped over my sister's shoulders. It went to fund the illusion of a billionaire lifestyle because Terrence was completely broke. Terrence did not just commit corporate fraud, he robbed the children of this community to dress his mistress. The tense silence in the ballroom shattered completely. It was not just a gasp, it was an eruption of absolute outrage. The wealthy church elders who had been comforting Jasmine only minutes earlier now stared at her with expressions of sheer revulsion. An older woman near the front physically moved her chair away from Jasmine's table, as if the emerald green dress was a disease. Whispers turned into loud, angry murmurs. People were pointing at the screen, pointing at Terrence, and shaking their heads in utter disbelief. Vivian looked like she was going to faint. The proud, elitist matriarch slumped back in her chair, the color completely draining from her face, as she realized her precious family name was permanently destroyed in front of the only high society she cared about. She looked at her son with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Pastor Davis stepped forward, his face a mask of profound betrayal and disgust. He looked down at Terrence, shaking his head slowly. "You stole from the children, Terrence," the pastor said, his voice trembling with righteous anger. "You stole from the house of God." Terrence could not take it anymore. The polished, arrogant facade he had maintained for years finally cracked under the crushing weight of public humiliation. He let out a deafening, furious roar that echoed over the angry crowd. He kicked his chair backward, sending it crashing onto the polished marble floor. "You lying psycho!" Terrence screamed, his face twisted into a mask of violent panic. He lunged forward, knocking over a tray of champagne glasses as he charged directly toward the stage. His fists were balled tightly at his sides, his eyes wild with the desperate fury of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He hit the first velvet-covered step and kept coming, charging up the stairs, to physically stop me from exposing any more of his shattered world. Terrence cleared the distance between his front row table and the stage in a matter of seconds. His face was a contorted mask of pure, violent desperation. He did not care about the hundreds of wealthy onlookers. He did not care about his reputation anymore. He only wanted to silence the woman who was systematically dismantling his entire life. His heavy footsteps pounded against the wooden floorboards of the stage as he closed the final gap between us. He reached his hands out, his fingers curled into tight fists, fully intending to tackle me right into the massive digital projection screen. I did not even blink. I stood perfectly still, my posture relaxed, my expression completely unbothered. I knew I was not in any real danger. Before Terence could even come within 3 feet of me, two towering figures emerged from the heavy velvet curtains at the edge of the stage. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute military precision. They were wearing immaculate black suits with subtle communication earpieces discreetly tucked into their ears. These were not standard venue security guards. They were Connor's elite private protection detail. When Connor discovered Jasmine trying to break into his penthouse earlier that day, he had immediately dispatched his personal team to my location, knowing my family was becoming erratic and dangerous. I had gladly accepted the courtesy. The first guard intercepted Terence effortlessly, sidestepping his clumsy charge and grabbing him by the shoulder. The second guard swept a heavy boot behind Terence, hitting the back of his knee with clinical accuracy. Terence let out a sharp cry of shock as his legs gave out completely beneath him. The guards forced him down hard. The loud thud of his knees hitting the wooden stage echoed through the grand ballroom. They pinned his arms securely behind his back, pressing him firmly onto the floor right at my feet. The great Terence Wilson, the supposedly brilliant hedge fund manager and pillar of the community, was now kneeling on a public stage restrained like a common criminal. He struggled wildly against the guards, panting and sweating, his face pressed toward the floorboards. The ballroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. Gasps of horror turned into shouting. I could see the flash of cell phone cameras illuminating the dark room as Atlanta's elite eagerly documented the spectacular downfall of the Wilson family. Down in the front row, Vivian had finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. Seeing her precious golden boy physically subdued and humiliated was the ultimate insult to her aristocratic pride. Her pristine social standing was being slaughtered in front of the mayor and the city council, and she needed someone to blame. Vivian stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. She marched toward the stairs, her heavy diamond necklace swinging violently against her chest. She climbed the steps with a frantic, terrifying energy, her eyes locked onto me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She ignored the security guards completely. She ignored the murmurs of the crowd. She viewed me not as a successful woman, but as an insolent subordinate who had forgotten her place. Vivian reached the top of the stage and stormed directly into my personal space. She raised her right hand, pulling her arm back to deliver a vicious, open-palm strike right across my face. She wanted to slap me into submission. She wanted to reassert her dominance and put the blue-collar girl back in her place. My reflexes were faster. I did not flinch or step back. My right hand shot upward, cutting through the air. I caught her wrist mid-air, my fingers clamping down around her delicate bones like a steel vise. The kinetic energy of her swing stopped instantly. The loud slap she had intended to deliver never happened. Vivian gasped in shock, her eyes widening as the physical reality of the moment washed over her. She tried to yank her arm away, but my grip was absolutely unbreakable. The power dynamic shifted permanently in that single fraction of a second. She was entirely at my mercy, and we both knew it. I stared down into her panicked eyes. I slowly lowered the silver microphone to my side, pressing the mute button with my thumb. I cut off the audio feed completely, ensuring that the remainder of this conversation would be an intimate, terrifying secret between the three of us. The crowd could see us, but they could no longer hear us. I leaned in incredibly close to Vivian. My face was only inches from hers. I spoke in a voice that was deadly quiet but sharp enough to draw blood. "You are so proud of his fertility, Vivian," I whispered, watching the arrogant fire in her eyes slowly begin to flicker. "You bragged to this entire congregation. You are so proud he is finally giving you heirs to carry on your precious family legacy." Vivian swallowed hard, trying unsuccessfully to pry her wrist from my iron grip. She opened her mouth to spit another insult, but I cut her off, tightening my hold just enough to make her wince. "Tell me," I continued, my voice dropping into a dark, chilling register. Why was I the only one taking the IVF test for the last 10 years? The question hit her like a physical blow to the chest. All the color instantly drained from Vivian's face, leaving her looking like she had just seen a ghost. Her skin turned a sickly pale shade of gray, and her lips began to tremble. The terrifying truth of my words shattered the very foundation of her reality. For a decade, I had endured the painful hormone injections, the invasive medical procedures, the quiet tears in empty nursery rooms. I had endured the vicious gossip at her country club luncheons, where she happily let her friends blame my body for our lack of children. I had taken all the blame because Terrence absolutely refused to be tested. He claimed his masculinity was beyond question, and Vivian had supported his refusal, protecting his fragile ego at the expense of my sanity. Down on the floorboards, Terrence suddenly went completely still. He had been thrashing against the tight grip of the security guards, but my quiet words had reached his ears. The fight drained out of his body in an instant. He realized exactly what I was implying. He remembered my sister Jasmine standing in the middle of a luxury car dealership, rubbing her swollen belly and demanding a custom Range Rover for carrying his twins. Terrence slowly lifted his head from the floor. He looked past the polished black shoes of the security guards and stared directly at his mother. He saw the absolute horrifying guilt written all over her ghost-white face. The mathematical impossibility of his new life was crashing down on him. If he had never been tested, and I had always been perfectly healthy, the miraculous twins my sister was currently carrying could not possibly belong to him. The seed of doubt had officially been planted, and it was already tearing his mind apart. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and suffocating. Terrence stopped struggling against the firm grip of Connor's security guards. His chest heaved as his eyes darted from my face to the terrifyingly pale complexion of his mother. The violent rage that had possessed him only seconds ago vanished entirely, replaced by a creeping, horrifying realization. I released Vivian's wrist with a sharp flick of my hand, letting her arm drop uselessly to her side. She stumbled backward, her diamond necklace catching the stage lights as she desperately tried to put distance between us. "What does she mean?" Terrence demanded, his voice cracking as it echoed through the quiet room. "Mother, what does Aaliyah mean about the tests?" Vivian opened her mouth, but only a pathetic stammer escaped her lips. She looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, church elders, and city council members who were watching her family implode in real time. The elite society she worshipped was currently witnessing her ultimate humiliation. She reached out and grabbed Terrence by the shoulder of his custom tuxedo, trying to pull him up from his knees. "We need to leave right now, Terrence," she hissed, her voice trembling with absolute panic. "Do not listen to a single word this woman says. She is a liar. She is trying to turn you against your own family. We are leaving this instant." But Terrence did not move. He planted his knees firmly into the wooden floorboards, refusing to stand. He stared up at his mother, and the sickening truth finally clicked into place behind his eyes. For 10 years, he had categorically refused to step foot inside a fertility clinic. He had proudly maintained that his genetics were flawless, and that any failure to conceive was entirely my burden to bear. And Vivian had nurtured that delusion, wrapping his fragile male ego in a protective blanket of denial. She had allowed me to endure countless rounds of painful hormone injections while she gossiped with her country club friends about my broken body. "You knew," Terrence whispered, his voice dropping into a devastating hollow register. "You knew I was the reason we could not have children, and you let me believe it was her. And now you are protecting Jasmine because you are so desperate for a legacy that you do not care who actually fathered those twins." Vivian shook her head wildly, tears of pure shame finally spilling over her expertly applied makeup. She tugged at his jacket again, pleading with him to stand up and walk out the side exit before the scandal ruined them permanently. But the damage was already done, and it was irreversible. Down on the main floor, Jasmine realized her entire world was rapidly disintegrating into ash. The hedge fund was gone. The secret offshore accounts were frozen. My mother's retirement fund had crashed to zero. And now her ultimate trump card, the supposed heirs to the Wilson family empire, had just been exposed as a biological impossibility. The billionaire lifestyle she had stolen from me was completely gone, and she was left standing in the middle of a massive ballroom, wearing an unpaid designer gown with absolutely nothing to her name. Jasmine began to hyperventilate. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps as the wealthy church ladies backed away from her, treating her like a walking contagion. The luxurious illusion she had meticulously crafted was shattered. Connor had locked her out of his penthouse, Brenda had thrown her out onto the street, and Terrence was currently staring at her from the stage with an expression of pure homicidal betrayal. Instead of feeling remorse, Jasmine reverted to the only defense mechanism she had ever known. She went on the attack. She pushed past a table of stunned city officials, her high heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor as she marched toward the front of the stage. Her face was flushed dark red with furious, indignant rage. "You are a liar!" Jasmine screamed, pointing a shaking finger up at me. "You set this whole thing up because you are a bitter, jealous woman who could not keep her own husband. You are just mad because he chose me." He looked at you and saw a cold, unfeeling corporate robot, and he came to me for warmth. "You think you are so powerful standing up there in your white suit, but you are nothing but a sad, lonely failure." I looked down at her from the edge of the stage, completely unfazed by her hysterical tantrum. "You slept with my husband in my house, Jasmine," I replied, my voice projecting clearly without the microphone. "You stole from our mother. You conspired with a fraud to steal charity funds from this church, and you convinced a man with a 0 sperm count that he was the father of your children. I am not lonely or bitter. I am the woman who just took out the trash." Jasmine opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but the words never materialized. Instead, her eyes widened in sudden, absolute terror. She let out a sharp, agonizing gasp, and her hands flew to her swollen stomach. The furious red color drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and clammy. She doubled over, grabbing the edge of a nearby cocktail table so hard her knuckles turned white. The sheer volume of stress, the consecutive shocks of losing the money being thrown out by our mother, and the public exposure of her paternity lie had pushed her body past its absolute breaking point. Jasmine let out a prolonged, guttural moan of pure, excruciating pain that silenced the entire ballroom. She squeezed her eyes shut, her knees buckling slightly under the sudden intense pressure. Then the unthinkable happened. Jasmine looked down in absolute horror as a dark, wet patch rapidly spread across the front of her emerald green maternity dress. A second later, a clear puddle of fluid splashed onto the pristine marble floor directly beneath her expensive heels. The entire room gasped in unison. Several women shrieked, covering their mouths in shock. Jasmine was only 7 months along. Her water had just broken 2 full months early. The extreme psychological trauma of the evening had triggered premature labor right in the middle of the most prestigious gala in Atlanta. She collapsed onto the floor, screaming in agony as the first massive contraction hit her body. The fancy church ladies who had been judging her moments ago suddenly snapped into action, rushing forward to support her head and call for help. Pastor Davis grabbed the microphone from my hand and frantically yelled for someone to dial emergency services. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos as the distant sound of ambulance sirens began to wail in the downtown streets, echoing the spectacular collapse of my sister's stolen life. The sterile white corridors of Emory University Hospital felt like a completely different universe compared to the opulent ballroom we had just left behind. The sharp, biting smell of industrial antiseptic replaced the heavy scent of expensive floral arrangements and designer perfumes. The harsh fluorescent lights beamed down on the waiting room outside the maternity ward, illuminating the absolute wreckage of the Wilson family in vivid, unforgiving detail. Terrence was pacing frantically back and forth across the gray linoleum floor, wearing a track into the polished surface. He had discarded his custom tuxedo jacket and ripped off his silk bow tie, leaving his expensive shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Despite the fact that his entire financial and social world had just imploded on a massive digital projection screen, he was still trying desperately to cling to the illusion of his perfect life. He was loudly projecting the image of a proud, anxious father to any passing medical staff who would listen. He kept rubbing his sweaty hands together and telling the nurses at the nearby station that his twin boys were on the way. He spoke with a manic, booming enthusiasm, trying to drown out the horrifying truth I had planted in his mind just hours earlier. He needed everyone in that hospital to believe he was a virile, successful patriarch, because if he stopped talking for even a single second, the reality of his biological impossibility would crush him entirely. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime, but the wild, panicked look in his eyes betrayed his deep internal terror. Sitting on a stiff plastic chair in the far corner of the waiting room was my mother. Brenda looked like a crumpled, broken shell of the arrogant woman who had marched through the mud at my construction site. Her yellow church hat was gone, and her pristine suit was wrinkled and stained from the chaotic rush to the hospital. She was rocking back and forth, clutching a damp tissue and weeping loudly. But Brenda was completely incapable of genuine self-reflection. Even now, as her favorite daughter was in emergency premature labor and her own retirement funds were completely gone, she needed a scapegoat. She could not accept that Jasmine had caused this disaster, so she naturally directed all of her venom at me. Even though I was not even in the room yet, she was loudly complaining to Vivian, who sat frozen and catatonic 2 chairs away. Brenda sobbed that this was all my fault. She claimed my bitter jealousy and my cruel public stunt had stressed poor Jasmine to the point of physical collapse. She wailed that I was trying to kill my own niece and nephew out of spite. Vivian did not respond to my mother at all. The proud elite matriarch simply stared blankly at the beige wall ahead of her, traumatized into total silence by the public destruction of her precious family name. The soft mechanical chime of the elevator doors opening cut through Brenda's hysterical sobbing and Terrence's manic pacing. The heavy metal doors slid apart, and I stepped into the maternity waiting room. I had not bothered to change out of my custom white silk tuxedo. It still looked razor-sharp and completely unblemished, a stark, brilliant contrast to the disheveled, miserable mess of the people sitting in front of me. In my right hand, I held a thick, securely sealed manila envelope. I did not walk in alone. Connor walked right beside me, his presence commanding instant, undeniable attention. He wore a dark, tailored suit and moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned absolutely everything he looked at. The air in the waiting room seemed to instantly freeze the very moment we crossed the threshold. The nurses stopped typing at their keyboards. Terrence stopped his manic pacing mid-stride. He whipped around to face the elevators, his eyes darting wildly between the thick envelope in my hand and the billionaire standing next to me. The fake proud father act dropped instantly, replaced by a deep territorial panic. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack, and his hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. "What the hell is he doing here?" Terrence demanded, his voice echoing loudly down the quiet hospital corridor. He took an aggressive step forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at Connor. "This is a private family matter, Aaliyah. My sons are being born in there right now. You have absolutely no right to bring this man to my children's birth. Get him out of here right now before I call hospital security and have him thrown out onto the street." I did not flinch, and neither did Connor. Connor simply slipped his hands into his pockets and looked at Terrence with an expression of profound, devastating pity. He slowly lifted his left wrist, pulling back the pristine cuff of his jacket to casually check his expensive watch. He let out a soft, amused smirk that communicated perfectly how utterly insignificant Terrence was to him. Connor did not even dignify the pathetic outburst with a response. He just leaned back against the cool hospital wall and waited, letting the heavy, deafening silence humiliate Terrence even further. Brenda jumped up from her plastic chair, pointing her damp tissue at me, her face twisted in rage. "How dare you show your face here?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. "You caused this, Aaliyah. You put my baby girl in that delivery room. If anything happens to Jasmine or those sweet, innocent babies, it will be on your conscience forever. You are a monster." I completely ignored my mother. She was nothing more than irrelevant background noise now. I walked slowly and deliberately across the waiting room, the soft, authoritative click of my boots echoing against the floor. I walked right past Brenda, right past the catatonic Vivian, and stopped directly in front of Terence. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he tried to look intimidating, but his eyes were darting nervously to the thick manila envelope in my hand. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a steep cliff, waiting for the wind to push him over. I gracefully took a seat in one of the stiff plastic chairs directly across from him, crossing my legs with total composure. I rested the manila envelope on my lap, smoothing my hand over the sealed flap. Terence stared at it as if it were a live explosive device. I could see the pulse pounding rapidly in his neck. "I brought a gift for the babies, Terence." I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm, cutting through the frantic, suffocating tension of the room. Terence swallowed hard, refusing to look away from the package. "What is that?" he rasped, his voice barely more than a terrified whisper. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his panicked, sweating face. Actually, I corrected myself, holding the heavy envelope out toward him. "It is a gift for you. I think you should open it before the nurses come out and ask you to sign the birth certificate." Terence stared at the thick manila envelope in my hand as if it were a venomous snake. His right hand twitched involuntarily. He desperately wanted to snatch the package away from me, but his overwhelming cowardice kept him completely frozen in place. He was absolutely terrified of what my private investigators might have uncovered about his ruined finances. He opened his mouth to hurl another empty, aggressive threat, but the heavy double doors of the maternity ward suddenly swung open. A doctor wearing light blue surgical scrubs and a tired smile stepped out into the waiting area. He pulled his mask down around his neck and looked directly at Brenda and Terence. The tension in the room instantly shifted from suffocating hostility to desperate anticipation. The delivery was complicated, but successful. The doctor announced, his voice echoing down the sterile linoleum hallway. "Mother and babies are doing just fine. We have 2 healthy boys. They are small, but they are incredible fighters. You can go in and see them right now." The transformation in Terence was immediate and absolutely sickening to witness. The crippling fear that had just paralyzed him completely evaporated into the stale hospital air. It was instantly replaced by that familiar toxic arrogance I had endured for 10 long years. He puffed out his chest, standing up taller, and adjusting the collar of his ruined tuxedo shirt. He looked down at me with a sneer of absolute superiority, completely ignoring the envelope still resting in my hand. He actually laughed, a cruel grating sound that bounced off the pale hospital walls. He turned his back on me and swaggered down the hallway, following the doctor through the swinging double doors. Brenda practically sprinted after him, weeping tears of absolute joy, and loudly praising God for the miraculous preservation of her family line. I did not move from my plastic chair right away. I just sat there holding the heavy envelope, feeling Connor's quiet, steady presence standing guard beside me. Connor checked his expensive watch again, completely unbothered by the dramatic display unfolding in front of us. After a few moments, I stood up and slowly walked down the corridor toward the private recovery rooms. The blinds on the large glass viewing window of Jasmine's room were pulled wide open for the world to see. I stood in the hallway shadows, watching the sickeningly sweet family reunion unfold inside. Jasmine was lying in the hospital bed, looking incredibly pale and exhausted, but managing a weak, triumphant smile. Brenda was hovering over her, stroking her hair, and crying tears of pure relief. And then there was Terence. He was standing near the center of the room, awkwardly holding 2 tiny swaddled bundles in his arms. He looked like a king admiring his newly conquered territory. He turned his head and caught sight of me standing on the other side of the glass. The smirk that spread across his face was the most repulsive thing I had ever seen. He locked his eyes directly onto mine, holding the babies up slightly higher. He wanted to make absolutely sure I saw him. He wanted to make sure I understood that he had finally achieved the one thing I could never give him. Slowly and deliberately, he mouthed 2 specific words through the thick pane of glass. "My legacy." Looking at his smug, arrogant face, I felt a sudden rush of agonizing memories crash over me. I remembered the 10 brutal years of our marriage, I remembered the endless cycle of fragile hope and devastating grief. I remembered sitting completely alone in cold, sterile clinic waiting rooms, filling out endless pages of medical intake forms, while the receptionist gave me pitying looks. I remembered the physical agony of the specialized fertility treatments. I remembered standing in the massive marble bathroom of our mansion, night after night, injecting my own stomach with thick, painful synthetic hormones because Terrence could not even bear to look at the medical needles. I remembered the brutal side effects that ravaged my body. The extreme weight fluctuations, the blinding migraines, the crushing emotional volatility. I endured it all in absolute silence. And I remembered exactly why I endured it entirely alone. Whenever I begged Terrence to come to the clinic with me, to simply provide a biological sample or undergo a basic medical consultation, he would fly into a violent narcissistic rage. He would pace around our bedroom, shouting about how incredibly offensive my request was to his manhood. He would point his finger right at my face and declare that his bloodline was completely flawless. He claimed that the proud men in his prestigious family had never had a single issue producing strong, healthy heirs. He told me repeatedly that the failure rested entirely within my own biological incompetence. He made me feel broken, empty, and totally worthless. I spent countless nights crying so hard into my pillow that I could barely breathe, choking on my own tears, while Terrence slept soundly right next to me, completely unbothered by my profound pain. He convinced me that I was a barren failure. But standing in that hospital hallway, watching him mouth the word legacy over a pair of children that did not even belong to him, the pain completely vanished. The deep, lingering grief evaporated into nothing. All that remained was cold, calculated, righteous justice. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and walked right into the private recovery room. Brenda spun around her face, instantly twisting into a mask of pure, violent fury. She opened her mouth to scream at me to demand that security throw me out, but Connor stepped right into the doorway right behind me. His dark tailored suit and imposing frame entirely blocked the exit. He crossed his arms and stared Brenda down, challenging her to make a single move. She wisely snapped her mouth shut and took a frightened step back. I ignored my mother completely. I ignored Jasmine, who was suddenly shrinking back against her hospital pillows, her eyes darting nervously toward the envelope in my hand. I walked straight up to Terrence. He puffed his chest out again, trying to project the image of a protective father defending his newborn sons. The smug, arrogant smirk was still plastered across his face. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply raised the thick manila envelope and slapped it directly against his chest, right over his rapidly beating heart. I brought a gift for the babies, Terrence. I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper that carried clearly to every single corner of the silent room. Actually, it is a gift for you. I think you should open it right now before you sign a single birth certificate. Open it, Terrence. It is from your old pediatrician. Terrence stared down at the heavy manila envelope resting against his chest. For a split second, his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine panic, but his massive ego quickly overrode his fear. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely hollow in the quiet recovery room. He snatched the envelope from my hand with an aggressive swipe, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. He looked over at Brenda and Jasmine, rolling his eyes, as if he were dealing with an irrational child throwing a tantrum. "You are completely pathetic, Aaliyah," he sneered, tapping the envelope against his free hand. "You actually came all the way down here to a maternity ward just to hand me fake documents. You just cannot stand the fact that I moved on. You cannot stand looking at these two beautiful boys and knowing that my bloodline is continuing without you. You are so desperate to ruin my legacy that you went through the trouble of forging medical records." I did not say a single word. I just stood there with my arms resting at my sides, maintaining steady eye contact with him. Connor remained perfectly still in the doorway, a silent, imposing guard, ensuring nobody interrupted the execution. His dark eyes watched Terrence with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a trapped rat. Terrence ripped the top of the envelope open. He tore the thick paper aggressively, clearly intending to pull out whatever was inside, glance at it, and dramatically throw it into the trash can. He wanted to perform for Brenda and Jasmine to prove that nothing I could possibly bring would ever threaten his newfound happiness. He reached inside and pulled out a stack of medical records stapled together at the top corner. The pages were slightly yellowed at the edges, showing their obvious age. The heavy black ink of the official hospital letterhead was stamped clearly across the top of the first page. Terrence snapped the pages open, holding them up to the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. He prepared his face for a mocking smile. He opened his mouth to deliver another cruel insult, but the words never came. I watched in absolute silence as his eyes scanned the first paragraph. The arrogant smirk that had been permanently plastered across his face for the last decade completely vanished. The warm color drained from his cheek so rapidly he looked as though he were going to pass out right there on the linoleum floor. The loud, confident breathing of the proud patriarch stopped, instantly replaced by shallow, ragged gasps. "What does it say, Terrence?" my mother demanded, her voice shrill and impatient. "Stop looking at it and throw it away. It is just more of her bitter, jealous lies." But Terrence could not throw it away. His hands began to shake. It started as a small tremor in his fingers and rapidly, violently escalated until the heavy medical papers were rattling loudly in his grip. He flipped to the second page, his eyes darting frantically back and forth across the typed text. He was reading a comprehensive medical evaluation from exactly 15 years ago. He was reading the detailed pediatric and urology consultation from when he was 21 years old and attending university. He had contracted a severe case of the mumps during his junior year of college. The virus had not just caused a fever and swollen glands. It had triggered a devastating internal complication known as bilateral mumps or orchitis. The official medical summary outlined the absolute destruction of his reproductive tissue. And at the very bottom of the final page, the attending specialist had written a definitive, irreversible conclusion. I had taken the liberty of highlighting that specific conclusion in bright neon yellow ink so he could not possibly miss it. Total bilateral testicular atrophy. 100% sterile. 0 sperm count. Terrence read the highlighted words over and over again. His entire body began to tremble as the suffocating reality crashed down upon him. For 10 years he had blamed me for our empty nursery. For 10 years he had refused to step foot inside a fertility clinic, claiming that his genetics were flawless and that my body was a broken, useless vessel. For 10 years he had allowed me to inject myself with painful, invasive hormones and cry myself to sleep in absolute agony, while he paraded around like an untouchable alpha male. And the entire time he was the one who was completely, irreversibly hollow. He had been shooting blanks since he was 21 years old. It was biologically, medically, physically impossible for him to father a child. Terrence slowly lifted his head. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with a terrifying mixture of absolute devastation and homicidal rage. He turned his head and looked at Jasmine. She was sitting up in the hospital bed, her face pale and covered in cold sweat. She was clutching the 2 newborn babies against her chest, looking like a trapped animal, knowing the walls were closing in. She opened her mouth to speak, but she could not find any words to explain away the undeniable medical truth currently shaking in his hands. "Those are not my sons," Terrence whispered, his voice cracking. It was a horrifying, broken sound. He stared at the twin boys wrapped in their little blue hospital blankets, and the final shattered pieces of his massive ego dissolved into dust. He had thrown away his entire marriage, his reputation, and his massive wealth to protect a legacy that was literally impossible to create. Jasmine had played him for an absolute fool. She had found a wealthy, arrogant Mark and convinced him he was the father of another man's children just to secure a luxury lifestyle. Terrence gasped for air, clutching his chest as if he were having a massive heart attack. He stumbled backward, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. The violent trembling in his hands reached a breaking point. His fingers completely gave out. The heavy stack of medical papers slipped from his grasp and fluttered through the air, scattering across the cold hospital floor. The final page landed face up, directly in the center of the room, the bright yellow highlighter glowing under the harsh overhead lights. 0 sperm count. Terrence fell to his knees, gasping for oxygen, his hands pulling at his own hair. He let out a guttural, agonizing sound of pure absolute defeat. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden door of the recovery room was pushed open. Vivian walked in. She had finally managed to pull herself together after the disaster in the ballroom and had come to check on her precious son. She stepped into the room, her eyes immediately landing on Terrence kneeling on the floor in absolute agony. Then she looked down. She saw the aged medical document resting right by her designer shoes. She saw the bright yellow highlighted text screaming up at her from the floor. Vivian froze, completely paralyzed in place. She recognized that document immediately because she was the one who had hidden it 15 years ago. Terrence stared at the floor, his chest heaving as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. He reached out with a trembling hand and snatched the medical document off the linoleum. He brought it close to his face, his eyes darting frantically over the bright yellow highlighter. He read the words again and again, desperately searching for some hidden loophole, some alternative explanation that would magically preserve his shattered ego. He slowly lowered the paper and looked at Jasmine. She was pressed as far back against the hospital pillows as she could possibly get, pulling the 2 tightly swaddled blankets defensively against her chest. The color had completely abandoned her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Terrence looked at the tiny sleeping infants, then dragged his wild, bloodshot eyes back to me. He shook his head violently from side to side, the denial kicking in as a final desperate survival mechanism. "This is a fake," he stammered, his voice sounding hollow and remarkably weak. He crushed the edge of the medical file in his fist. "This is a complete lie. You forged this because you are insane. You paid someone to type this up just to hurt me." I did not even blink. I slowly shifted my gaze away from his pathetic, crumbling facade and looked directly at the doorway. Vivian was standing there, absolutely paralyzed. The heavy hospital door was slowly swinging shut behind her, but she did not move an inch. Her immaculate posture had collapsed. Her shoulders were hunched, and her hands were trembling so violently that the expensive leather clasp of her handbag was rattling. Her eyes were glued to the crumpled paper in her son's fist. I smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that stretched across my face with ice-cold satisfaction. I tilted my head to the side, letting a tone of faux innocent surprise drip from my voice. "Wait," I said, allowing the word to hang in the suffocating silence of the room. "She did not tell you." Terrence froze. He stopped shaking his head and slowly, mechanically turned to look at his mother. I took a slow, calculated step forward, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. "I found that file hidden in the very back of her heavy iron safe in the attic. Just last week I explained, my words striking like physical blows. I was looking for some old property tax documents for the estate accountants. I knew the combination. I have known it for years. But I never expected to find a heavily guarded medical dossier from your college days buried under her old jewelry boxes." Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but her throat simply clicked. No sound came out. She looked at Terrence with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging him not to listen to me. "She knew, Terrence," I continued, my voice hardening into a sharp, unforgiving blade. "She knew that you were completely sterile since you were 21 years old. She took you to that specialist herself after your fever broke. She sat in that exact office and listened to the doctor tell her that her precious golden boy would never ever be able to father a single child. And instead of telling you the truth, she paid off the clinic, buried the records, and decided to protect your fragile masculine ego at all costs." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh as the memories of my own physical torture flooded back into my mind. "Do you have any idea what I went through for you?" I demanded, the raw, suppressed anger finally bleeding into my words. "I spent an entire decade believing that my body was broken. I sat in those bright, miserable waiting rooms listening to other women talk about their successful pregnancies while I felt like an empty failure. I let doctors poke and prod me with cold metal instruments. I injected my own stomach with hundreds of painful synthetic hormones until my skin was covered in deep purple bruises. I threw up from the nausea, I lost my hair from the stress, and I cried myself to sleep on the bathroom floor month after month. I took another step closer to Terrence, forcing him to look me in the eye. And your mother watched me do it. She sat in our parlor drinking her expensive tea, watching me destroy my physical and mental health to fix a problem that did not even exist. She watched me sob over negative pregnancy tests, knowing full well that her son was firing blanks. She let me take the blame for your biological failure for 10 agonizing years. The silence in the recovery room was absolute and terrifying. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic beep of Jasmine's heart monitor, which was currently racing at a panicked speed. Terrence stared at his mother. The crumpled medical file dropped from his hand for the second time, hitting the floor with a soft thud. His jaw trembled and the remaining color completely drained from his face. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal hit him all at once. The mother he had worshipped, the woman who had coddled him and told him he was perfect. His entire life had orchestrated the most devastating lie imaginable just to shield his pride. "You knew," Terrence screamed, his voice tearing out of his throat with such raw, primal agony that it made the glass windows vibrate. "You knew, and you let me believe I was a father. You let me plan a legacy. You lied to me my entire life." Vivian raised her trembling hands, stepping back toward the hallway. "Terrence, please," she sobbed, tears finally breaking through her stoic mask. "I was protecting you. I just wanted you to be happy. I wanted you to feel like a real man." The words were the final nail in the coffin. A real man. Terrence's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated, psychotic realization. The gears in his head violently slammed together as he connected the final horrific dots of the puzzle. He slowly turned his head away from his weeping mother and locked his manic, wild eyes directly onto Jasmine. Jasmine pressed herself completely flat against the headboard, her eyes wide with total consuming terror. She clutched the two babies so tightly they began to squirm and fuss in their blankets. Terrence took a slow, heavy step toward her. His breathing was loud and ragged, sounding like a wild animal cornered in a trap. His hands balled into tight fists, his knuckles turning pure white. "If I am sterile," Terrence growled, his voice dropping into a terrifying guttural register that sent chills down my spine. "If I cannot have kids." He took another step forward, looming over the hospital bed, his shadow completely swallowing Jasmine. "Then whose babies are these?" Jasmine opened her mouth, a pathetic, high-pitched whimper escaping her lips, but she could not formulate a single word. She looked frantically around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden door to the recovery room was pushed open the rest of the way. The hinges creaked softly in the quiet room. Connor stepped casually through the doorway. He paused for a brief second, his dark eyes sweeping over the pathetic, shattered remnants of the Wilson family. He lifted his hands with smooth, deliberate grace and slowly buttoned his tailored suit jacket, locking his gaze directly onto Jasmine. Connor moved through the doorway with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a predator who had already completely cornered its prey. He finished buttoning his dark suit jacket, his face an impenetrable mask of cold, aristocratic indifference. The heavy hospital door clicked shut behind him, trapping the remaining members of the Wilson family inside a nightmare they could not escape. Jasmine let out a ragged, desperate gasp. The absolute terror in her eyes momentarily shifted into a sick, twisted glimmer of false hope. Her greedy mind was desperately grasping at straws, trying to find a way out of the apocalyptic wreckage. She looked at Connor and clearly calculated that her billionaire ex-husband had arrived to claim his biological heirs and rescue her from poverty. She pushed herself up slightly against the hospital pillows, clutching the swaddled twins against her chest. "Connor!" She sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "Thank God you are here. Terrence has gone completely crazy. Aaliyah is trying to ruin us. You have to protect us, Connor. These are your sons. Look at them. They are your beautiful boys. You have to take us home." Connor stopped at the foot of her hospital bed. He did not look at the newborn babies. He did not look at Terence, who was still kneeling on the linoleum floor, paralyzed by his own public castration. Connor looked exclusively at Jasmine, and his dark eyes were completely void of any warmth, any affection, or any mercy. "I know they are my sons, Jasmine," Connor said, his voice resonating with a smooth, chilling clarity that made the temperature in the room plummet. "I have known they were mine since the very second you publicly announced your miraculous pregnancy." Jasmine stopped crying. Her mouth hung open slightly, her false tears drying instantly on her pale cheeks. She stared at him, the illusion of her ultimate rescue rapidly crumbling under his icy stare. "You actually thought you were dealing with a fool," Connor continued, taking a slow, measured step closer to the edge of the bed. "You thought you could outsmart a man who built an empire by anticipating every possible risk. The moment you stood in my penthouse and demanded a divorce while rubbing your flat stomach, I had my private security team dig into every single movement you had made over the previous 6 months. And it did not take them long to find the paper trail you left at the Mercer Fertility Institute." Jasmine physically recoiled, pressing her spine so hard against the headboard that the plastic monitor behind her rattled. "For the benefit of the room," Connor said, keeping his gaze locked on Jasmine while projecting his voice so Terence and Vivian could hear every agonizing detail. "My former wife decided that a standard divorce settlement governed by our ironclad prenuptial agreement simply was not enough to fund her delusions of grandeur. So she went to the private clinic where we had frozen embryos from our first year of marriage. She forged my signature on the medical authorization forms, and she had my children implanted into her body entirely in secret." Terence let out a low, suffocated groan from the floor. He slowly raised his head, his bloodshot eyes darting between Connor and Jasmine. His jaw hung slack as the sheer scale of the deception began to penetrate his thick skull. Connor finally broke eye contact with Jasmine and looked down at Terence. The billionaire offered a brief, humorless smile that contained absolutely no sympathy. "And then she needed a smokescreen," Connor explained, his voice dripping with condescension. "She needed an airtight alibi to hide the timeline of the medical procedure so she could extract child support from me without triggering a legal war over the stolen embryos. She needed a man with a massive, fragile ego who would be so flattered by her attention that he would never question the sudden timing of a pregnancy. She needed a useful idiot." Terence flinched as if Connor had kicked him directly in the ribs. The word idiot echoed off the sterile hospital walls. He looked at Jasmine, his face contorted in a mixture of profound heartbreak and violent disgust. He had believed he was a magnetic, irresistible conqueror who had stolen a billionaire's wife. He had believed he possessed flawless genetics that had finally created his precious legacy. Now he was sitting on a hospital floor listening to a man explain how he had been nothing more than a convenient, gullible decoy. "You were the perfect mark," Terence Connor said, turning his attention fully to the broken man on the floor. "She knew your mother had convinced you that you were a genetic marvel. She knew you would be so blinded by your own arrogance that you would claim those children without asking for a single medical test. Her plan was actually quite ambitious. She intended to secure 18 years of astronomical billionaire child support from me while simultaneously tricking you into marrying her so she could steal half of Aaliyah's hedge fund fortune. She wanted to bleed us both dry." Terence let out a sudden explosive roar of pure, unadulterated madness. He scrambled up from the floor, his expensive tuxedo pants slipping on the scattered medical documents. He spun around and pointed a shaking, furious finger at Vivian, who was still trembling by the doorway. "You knew," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You knew I was sterile, and you let her play me for a fool. You let her destroy my marriage." Vivian shrank back, covering her mouth with her trembling hands, tears ruining her immaculate makeup. Terence then whipped around to face Jasmine. His chest heaved, and his eyes were wide with a terrifying, psychotic realization. "If I cannot have kids," he bellowed, the sound tearing through the quiet maternity ward, "then whose babies are these?" Connor did not even blink at the hysterical outburst. He calmly reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a crisp, folded legal document. He stepped forward, ignoring Terence completely, and tossed the heavy paperwork directly onto Jasmine's lap. The document landed heavily across the hospital blankets right next to the sleeping twins. You violated the morality and fraud clauses of our prenuptial agreement the moment you forged my medical consent, Connor said, his voice dropping into a deadly authoritative register. You get zero alimony, Jasmine, and I am filing for full sole custody of my children tomorrow morning. You are going to leave this hospital with absolutely nothing. Jasmine let out a piercing shriek that bounced sharply off the sterile hospital walls. She frantically scrambled forward, reaching out to grab the sleeve of Connor's pristine suit jacket, but he smoothly stepped back, letting her hand grasp nothing but empty air. The heavy legal document slipped off her lap and landed on the floor, joining the scattered pages of Terrence's medical records. She was hyperventilating now, her entire body shaking violently as she looked from Connor to Terrence and back again. She tried to formulate a sentence to beg for a second chance to construct another elaborate lie, but the absolute zero temperature in Connor's eyes silenced her completely. He looked at her as if she were a piece of garbage stuck to the sole of his expensive leather shoe. Terrence watched the exchange from his position on the floor, and the final remaining shred of his fabricated reality snapped. He watched the woman he had destroyed his life for groveling at the feet of another man begging for his billions. He finally understood that he was absolutely nothing to her. He was just a convenient idiot, a temporary bank account, a pathetic pawn in her greedy little game. The total devastation crashed down on him, physically crushing the breath out of his lungs. He slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the cold hospital linoleum. In one single devastating afternoon, he had lost absolutely everything. His supposed beautiful wife was a manipulative fraud. His precious twin boys belonged to the billionaire standing above him. His massive suburban mansion was gone. And his sacred manhood, his defining arrogant pride, was a complete biological illusion. He let out a pathetic whimpering sound, curling into a tight fetal position right there on the floor. Vivian watched her golden boy shatter into a million irreparable pieces. She took a tentative step toward him, reaching down to touch his shaking shoulder. But Terrence violently swatted her hand away, letting out a muffled scream of pure hatred toward the mother who had deceived him his entire life. Vivian stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat as a new, much more immediate terror suddenly washed over her face. She looked at her son rocking back and forth on the floor, and then she looked directly at me. I could see the exact moment her panic shifted from his broken ego to his impending criminal reality. The federal wire fraud charges were looming over Terrence like a dark storm cloud. The government was preparing to seize every single asset he had left. His bank accounts were frozen. The legal fees required to keep him out of federal prison were going to be astronomical, and Vivian was entirely, completely bankrupt. The haughty, arrogant matriarch who had spent 10 years looking down her nose at me suddenly dropped to her knees. Her expensive silk skirt pooled around her on the dirty hospital floor. She crawled forward, closing the distance between us, until she was looking up at me with desperate, tear-filled eyes. "Aaliyah, please," she begged, her voice trembling with a pathetic, whiny desperation I had never heard from her before. "Please, you have to help us. You are the only one who has any liquid capital right now. The federal prosecutors are threatening to indict Terrence by the end of the week. If he does not secure a top-tier defense team, they are going to lock him away for decades. You loved him once, Aaliyah. He is your family. Please, I am begging you for a loan. Just enough to cover the retainer fees. I will pay you back, I swear on my life." I did not take a single step back. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the miserable, groveling woman at my feet. I let her desperate sobs fill the quiet space in the room. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt nothing but cold, calculated closure. "You watched me inject hormones into my stomach for 10 years, Vivian." I said, my voice steady and completely empty of emotion. "You sat in my house drinking tea and watched me cry myself to sleep because I thought my body was a failure. You watched me endure absolute psychological torture just to protect your son's fragile masculine ego." I tilted my head slightly, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You get nothing." Vivian let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing forward onto her hands. Terrence continued to rock on the floor, weeping uncontrollably into his arms. Jasmine was violently sobbing in the hospital bed, staring blankly at the wall, as her luxury future evaporated into thin air. I turned my back on the entire pathetic scene. I did not say another word. I walked smoothly out of the recovery room, leaving them all to drown in the toxic nightmare they had created for themselves. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of their collective misery. I walked down the long, sterile hospital corridor, my heels clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. The air felt incredibly light in my lungs. The suffocating weight I had carried for a decade was permanently, completely gone. I was 10 feet away from the elevator banks when I heard the frantic slapping of footsteps rushing down the hallway behind me. "Aaliyah, wait!" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet corridor. I stopped and slowly turned around. My mother was practically sprinting toward me, her face red and completely out of breath. The vicious, arrogant fury she had displayed just 20 minutes earlier had completely vanished, replaced by a sickening, desperate panic. Her precious golden child was ruined. Jasmine had no billionaire husband, no naive sugar daddy, and absolutely no money. Brenda grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of my coat. "Aaliyah, you have to wait," she panted, forcing a fake, frantic smile onto her face. "Jasmine is in real trouble. That monster Connor is throwing her out on the street. She has nowhere to go, Aaliyah. She has no money and no home. But you just bought that massive new penthouse downtown. There is more than enough room for us. We are your family, Aaliyah. I am your mother. You have to take us in. You have to let us stay with you until Jasmine gets back on her feet." I slowly reached up and peeled her grasping fingers off my coat one by one. I opened my designer handbag and reached inside. I did not pull out my checkbook. I did not pull out the keys to my new penthouse. I pulled out a single printed piece of paper. I had purchased it 3 days ago, anticipating exactly this pathetic scenario. I placed the paper flat against Brenda's chest. She took it, her eyes darting down to read the text. It was a one-way Greyhound bus ticket back to her miserable tiny hometown in Ohio. I looked my mother dead in the eye and delivered my final goodbye. "You always chose her, Mom. Enjoy the ride." I turned around, pressed the elevator button, and stepped inside as the metal doors slid shut. The greatest lesson to take away from this story is that true power does not come from seeking bitter revenge or lowering yourself to the level of toxic people. It comes from maintaining your absolute dignity, focusing entirely on building your own magnificent success, and simply allowing manipulative individuals to orchestrate their own inevitable downfall. You never have to actively destroy those who have wronged you, because their own greed will always do the job for you. If you found inspiration in this journey of ultimate redemption, please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts below.